Hi everyone, this is introductory module or introductory video for module 7, which I've titled Existential Threat, Colonialism, Slavery, Apartheid, Eurocentrism, Afrocentrism, Africacentrism, all sorts of words that we're going to put after this. And not all of them are of the same kind, obviously. I mean, colonialism, slavery, and apartheid are vastly different kinds of things than Afrocentrism, but some of these things are the existential threat and some of them are the response to it. And so that's why I'm treating them in similar fashion here. And so in this module, what I want to do is acquaint you a little bit with some of the elements of colonialism. This is a formative element for African philosophy. In other words, some people might want to see an African philosophy that is that has no part of colonialism involved, so pre-colonial or something like that. We can access some of those things. We can look at ancient Egyptian thought. We can look at traditional thought of various sorts. But if you look at what is done in African philosophy today in a great many places, it has to come to terms with this legacy of colonialism. And so we have to take it head on. And we have to take it head on as a philosophical question, not just a political one or an economic one or sociological or something else. What effect, what relevance does this have to doing philosophy? So in this module, I'm going to show you some videos. This is a module where I'm not going to have a conversation like I usually do. That'll be coming back next week. I'm going to show you a variety of videos to get you acquainted with the idea of colonialism. Some of you will have thought about this in other courses, and that's great if you have. Some of these videos may in fact not actually be that informative to you if you've already thought about this quite a lot. But I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Everyone has some basic idea of what we mean when we talk about colonialism, as well as related ideas like settlers, like empire, things of that nature. And so I want to show you a few things. If you've taken my African Humanities course, a few of these things are overlapped with that. I try not to do very much of that if possible, but we do talk about colonialism there because it's unavoidable in both African humanities and in African philosophy. I want to look at some of the early post-colonial figures briefly, and I've got a few videos on that. Some of what are sometimes called the big men of Africa, and they were almost always men, and they were the first presidents of their countries or first leaders of their countries. So I've got a few kind of introductions to those, and many of them were very good figures, and some of them were truly horrible figures. And so we'll look at both of those. I've also got a video on the Rwandan genocide in this as well, and that's related to the question of the effects of colonialism. And so I was in Rwanda in 1997. The genocide was in 94, so only 3 years before. And the effects were still very raw. So I talk a bit about that in the video as well. So there's a bunch of things, related to colonialism. But what I want to talk about in this in this introduction here is I want to talk a little bit about the readings that I'm having you doing. The readings are from Frantz Fanon and Stephen Biko, and there's also some from the text as well, but I want to focus mainly on the Fanon and the Biko readings here. If you were to take philosophy in an African university today, there would definitely be work from Fanon and Biko, and in some cases, for some students especially, they would feel like that's really got to be the core of African philosophy. Let's get rid of the kind of classical Western figures. Let's look at Fanon and Biko especially, and then others that are related to them. So why is it that these two figures are so central, so important for so many people? Well, both of them speak back to colonialism, right? They're both talking about not just a definition of what colonialism is, but also ways of moving past it, of trying to not have it be the formative influence on philosophical thought and for that matter, the rest of life within Africa. And so, let's take a quick look through these, through these readings here, just so that you have a quick idea of what we're doing here. And so we're starting. So let's talk a little bit about Frantz Fanon and the excerpts we have here. These excerpts are from included in a book that was edited by Emmanuel Eze on Africana philosophy. And I wanted to choose these excerpts in part because I think they give a really good picture of Fanon's approach to colonialism and how he, he's really somebody who articulates, almost earlier than anyone else, how colonialism is not just a matter of a political effect or a sociological or economic effect, but it's really an existential and a personal and a psychological effect, and that's what you see in these excerpts that we have here. They're from the first two are from *The Wretched of the Earth*, which was published in 1961. The third excerpt is from *Toward the African Revolution*, published in 1964. Fanon died in 1961, died young, and so *The Wretched of the Earth* was the last book published during his life, and then there were some things published afterwards as well. He was trained as a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and so. And you can see that throughout the excerpts that you have here. He really focuses on the psychological, existential, personal effects of colonialism. And so in this first one concerning violence, he's giving us a fairly radical approach to violence in the face of continued colonialism. And, if you remember that date, 1961, when this was written, when this was published, this is really at the beginning of the time when African nations were getting their independent nationhood as opposed to being colonies of European powers. The first one was in Ghana in 1954, and there were a couple of them through the 50s. But then the real, many of them were happening in the kind of first half of the 1960s. And so, the question then becomes, what happens now? From our vantage point today, we look back at those days and we often talk about what we call neocolonialism, which was the immediate effect or the immediate state after the fall of the colonial relationships, which you might have hoped or thought that were going to be countries being able to govern themselves and being able to chart their own destinies and so forth, but the colonial relationships never really went away, and the colonial structures, the bureaucratic structures, the political structures never really went away. Not even the national boundaries, many of which were created under colonialism, they didn't go away either, and those boundaries could prove to be very problematic in a number of countries, including Kenya, Nigeria, a number of others as well. Now, what Fanon does in this piece here is he describes the colonial situation as what he calls a Manichaean situation. So that's a kind of two-state, good-evil state of the world, nothing in between, no kind of gradations between. And so colonialism assumes that that's the kind of world that we live in, and therefore, if that's the world, then the colonialists are on the good side and the Africans are on the evil side. And what Fanon argues is that produces a kind of effect that's felt down to the level of individuals. It permeates the bureaucracies. It permeates every step, every part of the experience of Black people on the African continent. And by the way, this is relevant to outside of Africa too, but we're talking about Africa here. So the question he's particularly concerned about is, what do Africans do about this? I mean, what is possible to do? And in these, he spends some time talking about the ways in which natives are, he uses the word natives, are regarded within a colonial context. And he brings us to the point of recognizing that this is not something that can be solved just through our usual rational structures by having a treaty or an agreement or a negotiation of some sort. And so this part that I've highlighted here is where he comes to that. The natives' challenge to the colonial world is not a rational confrontation of points of view. It is not a treatise on the universal, but the untidy affirmation of an original idea propounded as an absolute. The colonial world is a Manichaean world. It is not enough for the settler to delimit physically, that is to say with the help of the army and the police force, the place of the native. In other words, it's not enough to just herd people into homelands or camps or whatever. As if to show the totalitarian character of the colonial exploitation, the settler paints the native as a sort of quintessence of evil. Okay? And so, this is where he's kind of, making the case for colonialism setting up this dichotomy. And if the world is seen in that dichotomous way within colonial assumptions, then we've got a problem, right? I mean, where do you go from there? There's no negotiation to be had. There's no solution to that. There's no kind of easy handing over of power or something like that. So at the end of this excerpt, he talks about what's happening in Senegal, and this is a pretty indicative, I think. It's an interesting passage. He says, we know the fierce words of the Senegalese patriots, referring to the maneuvers of their president, Senghor, that's Leopold Sedar Senghor. We have demanded that the higher posts should be given to Africans, and now Senghor is Africanizing the Europeans. That is to say, the native can see clearly and immediately if decolonization has come to pass or not, for his minimum demands are simply that the last shall be first. Okay? And so what Fanon is saying here is that we have, these attempts at, imagining a kind of post-colonial situation, an anti-colonial situation, and yet what we end up with in places like Senegal are Africanizing the Europeans. In other words, some sort of middle ground that simply maintains the same situation that's always been there, which is to say the poor are still poor, the disadvantaged are still disadvantaged. There's been no kind of fundamental changes in structures that would allow anyone to have a different kind of society at a very fundamental level. And so, Fanon goes from there in this second piece to talk about, more about this notion of the Manichaean. And I'm sorry, by the way, for how terrible the reproductions, the PDFs are here. I know it's hard to read at the edges of the pages here. But anyway, Fanon, talks about this Manichaean world in some greater detail, and the ways in which, native education, and he uses the word native. I mean, remember, he's writing in the early 60s here, so he's going to use a different vocabulary than what we are used to or would think is appropriate today. But the native is always on the alert, for since he can only make out with difficulty the many symbols of the colonial world, he's never sure whether or not he has crossed the frontier. In other words, there's always a situation of uncertainty where people don't really know what is expected of them and what they can do and can't do. That's held over people, over and over. And so, throughout this passage, and I'm not going to go through it in any real detail because you're going to have a chance to read it, but throughout this passage, we get this very kind of clear sense of how, how the colonial world infuses absolutely every piece of the reality of African life. What's interesting in this piece as well is that Fanon, being the psychologist that he is, he connects this to a kind of sexual energy too. And so in other words, he wants to talk about the tensions that are part of a fundamental consciousness and are both at an individual and a societal level. So, I'd encourage you to read through this piece, and, what he gets to, and you see this highlighted piece down here, what is the real nature of violence? We have seen that is the intuition of the colonized masses that their liberation must and can only be achieved by force. And so this gets to, one of the, I guess, more famous things about Fanon, this advocacy of a certain kind of violence. Now, if you stop and think about this for a second, what we have, if you look at philosophers and the way they have thought about social change over time, you have everything from, versions of just taking it to passive non-resistance, a la Mahatma Gandhi, to civil disobedience, Henry David Thoreau, to using violence only as an absolute last resort and only when necessary, so something close to Mandela, to, versions of violence that are more preemptive. And what Fanon comes up with here is a kind of necessity of violence. And it's necessary not just because of the necessity to get to an outcome, although there is that, but it's also necessary from the point of view of dealing with this very psychological and existential effect of colonialism that's been had on people, right? I mean, imagine you live in Africa, imagine you're black. I know it's an active imagination for some people and not so much, for others, but, what if your country became independent, at this point decades ago? What if the poverty rates have not appreciably changed much? What if white people are still in control of the vast majority of the land? What if the best jobs go primarily to those who are already privileged? What if all of those sorts of things are still in place? What are your alternatives? Well, there are a few. You could try and work the system. You could try and have a develop a black middle class, let's say. South Africa has tried to do that. You could try and do what Zimbabwe did. Robert Mugabe basically, just took land from white farmers especially and redistributed it to black farmers. Economically, that was a disaster for Zimbabwe. Yet you can understand, if you decolonize and nothing changes, what is the answer at that point? Now, there's a lot of technical stuff that we could look at that would kind of propose a variety of answers. Some of those have been tried in Africa. Most of them have not gone all that well, right? So Fanon here is telling us there is a necessity for violence, and even if it's he obviously wants the outcome. He wants, those who were last to be first. But what he also wants is the ability to change a form of consciousness that has been in place at this point for generations. For people who have just taken it for granted that their lot is to be secondary. And Fanon's rationale for this is that he wants to say that colonialism is already violence. It may not present itself as violence, although it may, right? It may, as with apartheid South Africa, it might be quite overtly violent. It might, murder dissenters, as happened in South Africa. It might quell, demonstrations with extreme force. It might do all of those things. But even if it's not doing that, it is still violent, right? It is still a system which is, taking the dignity away from people bit by bit, bureaucratically, politically, educationally, all sorts of other ways. And so, Fanon's argument essentially is that it's a violence that has been done to the psyche and to the the social order of black Africans, and so we can't pretend that it's not violence, and therefore violence is the only possible response, especially if other ways have been tried and nothing works. So that's Fanon's argument. Okay, and it's important to understand Fanon's argument, whether whether one agrees with it or not. That is the place from which he is thinking about these things. And if you want to say, if your gut says, no, that can't be right, or, no, we don't want violence, he's kind of laid down the gauntlet. He's kind of said, well, if not this, then what? And he's described in great detail the consequences of living under colonialism for millions of people, right? I mean, he's just, if you just read this, you see the daily indignities that people have suffered. And the long-term, marginalization, all the rest of it, right? So he's described this in exquisite detail, and if someone does not think that violence is the answer, he is, I'm putting words in his mouth, I know, but he's going to want to ask, if not this, then what, right? If you think a negotiated change can happen, why would we want to think that when it never has happened yet? So that's, the second of the three readings from Fanon. So the third one is on racism and culture, and it's from toward the African Revolution. And really here he's just talking about, as he says in this highlighted excerpt, to study the relations of racism and culture is to raise the question of their reciprocal action. So what he's really after here is the idea that racism need not be an overt intended sort of phenomena. In other words, it need not be the case that somebody says in their heart of hearts, I am racist, now I'm going to think racist thoughts and do racist things. All that's needed is for racism to come to rest within cultural forms, to be part of the narratives that we use in society. And I guess the reason I like this excerpt that we have from Fanon is that, if you didn't know that it was written in the 1960s, you could think that it was written today, right? I mean, he really describes very well the ways in which, racism has a kind of plausible deniability about it. Like, everyone can say, I'm not racist. Yeah, I don't intend anything. I don't intend any racism. And yet, if you look at the ways that culture actually operates, if we look at the narratives that are just taken for granted, what you see is a very different situation, right? You see something in which racism has taken root at a level where there's deniability, and yet there's deep effects as well. And that's part of the arguments that we're having in the U.S. today, I think. I mean, a lot of people want to say that racism is over, right? I mean, and yet lots and lots of other people say there's no sense in which that's true. What Fanon focuses on are things like exoticism here, which is a certain way of thinking about the other, whether that other is a racial other or linguistic or something else. And it's a way of putting someone in a place where they're safe, where, in other words, they can't really ruffle the worldview that you've already got established. And so that's the third of the readings here. And again, I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail, but I'd like you to read through it because I think it's just so pointed. And again, I'm not asking everyone to agree with everything that someone like Fanon says, but he does throw down a gauntlet, right? He does say, okay then, if this is not the picture of how things happen, don't just give me your gut feeling about how you think it's different. Give me an argument, give me evidence, give me something that shows that there's a different way to think about it. And I think he makes a pretty powerful case. So the other person I want to talk a little bit about is Stephen Biko. And Stephen Bantu Biko was often thought of as the person who was the forefront of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa in the 60s and into the 70s. And so the background you need to understand, and he explains a little bit of this in the first few pages here. He explains about how Black intellectual life had gone before the 60s. He said it had been within the kind of Black institutions, especially the ANC, which is the African National Congress, which is a major political party that is in power now, but it was banned. And it was banned in the early 60s around what's called the Ravonia trial. Nelson Mandela and many others were sent to prison, to Robben prison in the Bay in Cape Town at that time. And so the ANC and a lot of other parties were banned at the time, and the effect that had was to essentially cut off a kind of, I was going to call it a conversation, but it's really the illusion of a conversation, right? The idea that, the evils of apartheid, which were represented by, the political party could be met by another political party which had different arguments and could win over other people. That was just not going to work in South Africa, in part because the legal structure that had been put in place made it impossible for there to be any real conversation about those things. And so once that party is abolished, any illusion that there could be that kind of intellectual conversation was gone. And so what Biko and others do is to essentially realize that there are other places, other structures where intellectual conversation can happen in South Africa. They don't have to be those formal structures. Biko focused on townships. He focused on universities. He focused on, the slums, the places where black people actually were. And what he did was to really kind of, draw on some of the work that was being done in civil rights movement in the U.S. He drew on negritude, the notions around negritude from Senegal and Paris and other places. He read voraciously. He brought a lot of stuff to bear on this. And the whole point was to think about how people of African descent, especially on the continent, could essentially think their own thoughts, could come up with a philosophical approach or philosophical ideas rooted in their own experience of their own world, instead of thinking that they had to start with a philosophical space that was not African. And so black consciousness was also about realizing, and Biko was admittedly influenced by Fanon in this, was also about realizing what stood in the way of that kind of understanding. And what stood in the way was the legacy of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. Fanon was writing from Algeria and from Tunisia, right? So that's northern Africa. Biko's writing from South Africa, right? So, very different political situation. In South Africa, there was a legalized racism called the system of apartheid. And so what do you do when the law of the land is essentially fundamentally racist? Well, you have to find another way to deal with that. And so Biko is doing that. He is, building a movement, essentially, answering not just answering the racist assumptions of the apartheid government, but also pushing back against the more liberal assumptions of especially white supporters and others who wanted to think about the situation in South Africa more around questions of class rather than race. That's a kind of a classic Marxist sort of approach. And so while Marxism pushed back hard on apartheid, it pushed back on apartheid for reasons of class. Biko wants to push back for reasons of race. And so there was cooperation, certainly, but there was also a lot of there could be a lot of tension. What Biko recognizes is that quite often the anti-apartheid movement was just as white as the pro-apartheid movement, right? So what they were essentially doing was letting white South Africaners speak on their behalf, and that is not the ability to speak from the experience of being marginalized by the apartheid system, right? So Biko's arguing for a kind of black presence within the resistance movement. He is also arguing for this in what we might call a Pan-Africanist manner. So he's seeing this not only as a problem in South Africa, and he recognized the difference in political systems compared to the U.S. and the Caribbean and Brazil and other countries in Africa and so forth, but he also saw the similarities. And so there's a kind of Pan-Africanism about him as well. A movement which is an attempt to say this is black consciousness, not just South African consciousness, South African black consciousness, or not just Zulu consciousness or Xhosa consciousness or something like that. So again, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but what I'm interested in this reading is for you to think about how this is relevant to philosophy, right? Because this interview reads like a kind of what were our strategic moves? What did we do at this point? What did we do at that point? And, if you're used to reading philosophy, it doesn't feel much like philosophy. It doesn't feel like a bunch of arguments. And yet I would want to maintain that this is pretty importantly philosophical as well. And so I guess the thing I'm hoping that you think about and talk about in the discussion area is, in what sense is what Biko is doing philosophical and not just, tactical, political, something like that. Okay, so those are the two readings I want to talk about, the Fanon and the Biko. And so I'm looking forward to what you have to say in the discussion area, and I look forward to your comments on the videos and all the rest of that. So thanks very much. Talk to you soon.